Okay, it's Monday night. We are beginning the book of Bamidbar. Our schedule will be a little bit interrupted for this Chumash because next a week from Shabbat is Shavuot. We don't have a regular Parshat Shavua, so we won't learn next Monday night. Um, but the following Monday night, which is already Memorial Day Monday, we will also not learn, will be postponed to Tuesday. So our
Okay.
next class will be not the 18th, because that's a week when there's no Parshat Shavua, not the 25th, because that's Memorial Day, but the 26th, Tuesday the 26th. And then we have a couple of other slight adjustments and reschedulings of times and days, but we'll take it one week at a time. In principle, we'll be rolling along on Monday nights, but there'll be a couple of reschedulements within the week. And our goal, as always, will be to go through the book of Bamidbar. We have our summer hiatus for Devarim, and we're returning to Rabbi David Foreman. We went through the book of Vayikra with his commentary. So for those who were there last year, you may remember his style. Uh, More conversational, speaks to the reader. Sometimes his tone, which is meant to be engaging and collaborative, can feel a little condescending's not the right word at all, but something on that spectrum of kind of making you feel like you're the child pupil. But the goal there, I think, is to draw in and engage different kinds of learners, help people feel that Torah is an adventure of discovery, and help open our eyes to, a method which we've seen in different ways, that relies on literary analysis of common words, common themes across stories that open up our eyes to the commonalities and the differences between them. And sometimes he stays more on that literary plane, often draws in other cultural references from outside the Torah world to help us understand the point that's being illustrated. And as we saw with Rabbi Golden's Points to Ponder section across the book of Vayikra, Rabbi Foreman kind of weaves in directly sometimes a little more homiletical, midrashic type messages. Um, and I think for those for whom the style doesn't land perfectly, and I'm one of those people, for me, the messages and the sharp readings make it very, very much worth the journey. So let me share my screen. We're going to jump into the length of the essays on the various parshiot vary widely. And there is in many of the parshiot only one essay per week. And so some of them are going to be far too long for us to be able to cover. But Shuli graciously agrees to scan the entire essay. So you have it for your reading and study pleasure. And we'll try to be selective, skip some parts, skim some parts for some of the weeks in order to get his overall message, but keep to time. And also already in 2 weeks, we'll be starting at 8:45 to allow for Mincha Marav attendees to incorporate that into their schedule. So, with all that said, I'm going to briefly touch on his intro, because I think it's a beautiful framing of the book of Bamidbar, and then we'll try to briefly, again, cover his essay on Bamidbar. Okay, so introduction. What is the book of Numbers about? And again, I'm just going to highlight some lines here. So first, he comments on the name of the book, literally means in the wilderness, and that is the geographic setting. But he also says, it's not just in a tangible sense, it's in a more metaphorical sense, a desert journey. It's a story about losing the anchors that help us feel at home, even as we journey physically through no man's land. But it's not just that, it's about what happens when we enter no man's land, not just physically, but spiritually as well. And those anchors that we lose that cause us to feel like we're entering a no man's land spiritually, he says, are our parents. And he goes through to talk about the idea that the book of Bamidbar is about learning to adjust to life without our parents, um, whether our literal parents or our spiritual parents. He begins by talking about the fact that in Parshat Naso, we're going to see the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, and that he considers that an incredibly concise parenting manual, and that theme about how parents let go of children and how children let go of parents is a very practical theme in the book. He mentions a couple of partings in the book, for example, Moshe from Yitro, but more broadly, that Bamidbar is about Bnei Israel parting from Moshe, Aharon, and Miriam, the generational leaders, and growing up in a sense. Within a mere few lines, right, the story of the hitting the rock seals the fates of all three major leaders. And no one will be there to usher this newly born nation into its land. And he structures this analysis literarily by pointing out a chiastic structure that in the end of Bamidbar, or the latter half of Bamidbar, we have Israel being attacked by surprise by the Canaanite king of Arad, who the sages say is a version of Amalek. Then the people are weary and speak about the man critically. This is again the middle of Bamidbar. Then they come on a wellspring of fresh water, and they sing a song, Az Yashir Yisrael Tashira Hazot, about the well in the wilderness. And he points out that this is an inversion of four events that happen right after Yetziat Mitzrayim. And he has a nice structure for us, and that is in Yetziat Mitzrayim. First, they sing the song after the at the sea. Then they search for water. Then they have the man, and then they have the attack by Amalek, and that reverses on the way out. So the entrance and near exit from the wilderness are marked by these four events. And he analyzes differences between these events to show that in each of them we see maturation of Bnei Israel and their capacity to transition to a time independent of their leaders or spiritual parents, and highlights that by noticing that the song at the sea is Az Yashir Moshe Uvnei Yisrael, and the song at the well in Bamidbar is Az Yashir Yisrael. And he points out two distinctions there. One, the absence of Moshe. Two, the Jewish people shift from Bnei Yisrael to Yisrael, which you could make a lot of or a little of. He makes a lot of it and suggests that that's literally the shift from children to a more mature nation of Israel. And develops this further, but that's kind of the heart of the idea. He goes on at length about talking about how relationships imbalances can be restored and the step movements to maturity, and locates all of that in the development of Bnei Israel in the book of Bamidbar. Again, you have that essay linked in the first email, and I encourage you to read it. And we'll just read the last paragraph. The book of Numbers is perhaps aptly named. As I mentioned before, in Hebrew, Bamidbar means literally in the wilderness. And that's an accurate description of the book. And
You're cut off.
It's cut off.
You're cut off, Rabbi.
This is a book about losing earth being left barren. It's all. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Now we
Can you
can,
hear
now
me
we
now?
can, yeah, now I can hear you.
Hold on. Okay, that's so unusual. All right, hold on. Let me just see if I can fix up my internet. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you.
Okay, great. Sorry for that blip. I'm going to pick up again from the third sentence here, or second. As I mentioned before, in Hebrew, Bamidbar literally means in the wilderness. And that's an accurate description of the book in all sorts of ways beyond the obvious. This is a book about losing one's earthly parents and confronting the fear of being left alone in a barren and austere world. But it's also about a nation's struggle to transcend childhood, to claim, however, tentatively a certain spiritual independence. Part of that independence is the realization that they're not really alone, as harsh as the world out there can seem. Yes, it's a wilderness, but the gifts of our heavenly parent, bread from the heavens, wells of water from the earth, protection from the marauders that threaten us, remain with us. They are constant reminders that our parent in heaven may be visible, may be invisible, but he is present in our world nevertheless, and it is up to us to build a lasting relationship with that God. Let's begin to read this book together. So again, I jumped over a lot here, but that's the theme that Rabbi Foreman wants us to consider in the book of Bamidbar, is separating from parents, achieving a maturity, and also understanding how the relationship with parents, even when they're not physically present, can remain a nurturing and sustaining force in our lives. Now we'll go to his essay on the Parsha of Bamidbar, which begins, Why We Count. He has one central textual insight here, which again I never noticed. I've sort of parts of it are familiar to me, but I think it's a really sharp textual insight. He then, develops it in a variety of ways. We won't dwell on all of them, but I want to make sure we see the textual insight, see a little bit of the way he develops it, the cultural reference that he incorporates. And if time remains before 9:30, I want to show you a couple of parallel divrei Torah out there in the Torah world, just to appreciate. I don't assume that any of the three divrei Torah that offer very, very similar messages necessarily saw each other, but remarkable to see them noticing similar things and sharing them. So here we go. As we crack open Sefer Bimidbar, I'd like to explore one of life's big questions with you. You can hear, if you know Rabbi Foreman, and you can hear the tone of his voice if you watch the Aleph Beta videos or you've had the opportunity to learn with him, you sort of know his conversational style and you can almost hear it in his voice. The question of how we find meaning in life. I'd like to do that from a bit of an unconventional perspective, using Parshat Bamidbar along with the work of three artists, Jackson Pollock, Claude Monet, and George Seurat, as a lens.
Wow.
If that sounds disjointed or unduly challenging, just hang on and let's see where this goes. Parshat Bamidbar is all about counting. The beginning of the book devotes scores of verses to the counting of the Israelites. It seems fair to ask, what's with all this counting? The emphasis on counting feels inordinate, especially since the one who requests a census here is actually the Almighty, God's self. One wonders why such a count was even necessary. Surely God knows how many Israelites there are without having to count them. As it happens, we're not the first ones to wonder about this. Rashi implicitly addresses the issue with the following enigmatic comment. This is Rashi on the very first verse. It says, in the wilderness at this particular date and time, God begins the instruction to count the people. And Rashi says there, Mitoch chibatan lefanav moneh otam kol sha'a. Because of God's love for Israel, God counts them all the time. By the way, just worth noting, there's a famous teaching about Rashi, that the first Rashi in each of the five books of the Torah somehow hinges on or makes reference to God's love of the Israelites. It's kind of a fascinating little insight. You can go through the Rashis and check them, but even thinking about the first Rashi or one of the Rashis on the first pasuk, Bereshit bara Elokim, you think, what does that have to do with Israel? But Rashi comments famously that Bereshit is interpreted midrashically as Bishvil Reshit, for the ones who are described as the first, and that is the Israelites, and develops the idea that in part the world was created for the purpose of the covenant with the Jewish people, etc. So the very first Rashi, or Rashi on the first pasuk in the Torah, comments on God's affection for the Israelites. Here we are in the fourth book of the Torah, same notion. Mitoch chibatan lefanav, because of God's love for Israel, God counts them all the time. Rashi suggests one of the parallel divrei Torah on this week's parsha that I noticed asks, what does it really mean that God counts them all the time? There's only three censuses in Bamidbar and only a handful more across the whole Tanakh. What does it actually mean? Something to think about. Rashi suggests that counting is an expression of love. As such, it serves more than a utilitarian purpose. It isn't just about knowing numbers. The process matters too. There's something about the act of counting, Rashi is suggesting, that conveys care and regard. Counting conveys love. Why does the act of counting carry such overtones? We find a clue, I think, in two key phrases, each of which conveys the idea of counting. Parshat Bamidbar, when the Torah discusses God's command to Moses to conduct this census, the text uses two verbs in particular. It doesn't use moneh or sofer, the ones we might most commonly associate with counting, but rather it's nasa and pakad. What's interesting about these two terms is that not only does each mean to count, but each also has another meaning too. The interplay between the two secondary meanings of each word is intriguing and, I believe, instructive. You can actually watch the secondary meanings of each word come into play if you pay close attention to the verses in our Parsha. Indeed, no sooner does the Torah in Parshat Bamidbar use both nasa and pakad to mean count, then it immediately employs the very same word to express its secondary meaning. This is what I found particularly cool. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Here is a verse in our Parashah, chapter 1, verse 49. With just a glance, you'll notice the verse contains forms of both roots. Achet mate levi lo tifkod, you can see it there in green if you can see it on the screen. Vet rosham lo tisa in blue, betoch bnei Israel. Do not count the tribe of Levi. Do not count their heads among the children of Israel. This is not the first time that these roots are used. It's, in the latter part of the first chapter, but it's an instance where both of them appear in the same verse, clearly meaning to count. Don't count the Levites in the midst of the count of the children of Israel. They're going to have their own census. But now look at the very next verse. Once again, you'll find words that derive from the very same roots, but this time neither term means count, right? So now we're in Bamidbar chapter 1, verse 50. V'ata hafked in green, ata leviim al mishkan ha'idut, hema yis'u et mishkan vet kol kelav. Now we have pakad, not meaning count, but you should appoint the Levites over the tabernacle. And now we have nasa, not meaning count, but they will carry the tabernacle and all its utensils, as Rabbi Foreman goes on to explain. Now, all of a sudden, pakad means to appoint. The Levites are to be appointed in charge of the tabernacle and all its utensils. And now, all of a sudden, nasa here means to carry, or literally, perhaps, to lift up. They will lift up the tabernacle. It seems as if the text wants us to perceive some kind of connection between counting and appointing, and between counting and lifting. So let's ponder that together. How might appointing and lifting, respectively, be conceptually connected to counting? Let's start with nasau, the word that means alternately to count or to lift up. Consider the following verse, which seems to be instructive. Su'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Israel. Count the heads of all the congregation of the children of Israel. Perhaps the verse doesn't just mean count the heads of the children of Israel. And this is, I think, an interpretation we are more familiar with, in particular with nasa, maybe more than pakad. It could also be translated as lift up the heads of the children of Israel. And maybe indeed the two ideas are connected. That is, perhaps God's counting the people has something to do with lifting up their heads. In other words, it seems that there's something affirming about God having us counted. It's almost like through the act of counting, someone who previously felt downcast is now able to hold their head high, right? Lift the heads. And now let's talk about that other Hebrew word for counting, pakad. Besides meaning to count, pakad also means to appoint or entrust with some sort of mission or task. In fact, the Hebrew word pikadon, collateral, denotes an object that is entrusted for safekeeping, right? It's not always only collateral. It could be just an object deposited to be watched over. In a way, when you are appointed to carry out some sort of responsibility, you've been entrusted with a kind of pikadon to watch over, to safeguard. Someone else is now counting on you, is trusting you to do the task they need done, and it is yours to do for them. I wonder, again, Rabbi Foreman's voice, if these secondary meanings of pakad and nasa, and trust and lift up, somehow connect with one another to give us a better sense of why being counted by God can be seen as an act of love. Counting is something you do when you enumerate the individuals in a larger community of which each is a part. In a way, being counted by God's command perhaps affirms the place that each individual has in that community. Indeed, we might well say, when can I lift up my head, nasa or nasat rosh? When I find myself entrusted, pakad. When I play a unique role in a community, when I'm charged with carrying out a piece of a shared mission much larger than myself, I really do feel like I count. When, on the other hand, I live only for my own self-preservation, what's really the point? The relationship between the individual and the community, however, does not always recognize the value of the individual. This special combination of pakad and nasa that we've been talking about is unique to communities that somehow manage to celebrate the individual, even as they organize themselves to achieve noble tasks no individual could possibly achieve on their own. But that kind of relationship between one and many can't be taken for granted. one might imagine two other kinds of relationships between the individual and the community, each of which fails by veering dangerously toward one extreme or the other. At one end, what if a community has a sense of cohesion that is so dramatic, so pronounced, that it squashes all sense of individuality among its members? Totalitarianism can create faceless communities. There remains no room for individuality in a community that swallows everything. At the opposite extreme, one can imagine enthroning the role of the rugged individual so profoundly that individuals living in proximity to one another, who comprise a neighborhood, a city, or even a nation, never really cohere to form a group in a meaningful way. Sure, they may share a common postal code, but they are really nothing more than a whole bunch of people living near each other. There is no sense of shared why, no sense that I am contributing to a well-articulated or even implicitly clear overarching goal or set of principles. This is another kind of failed community. By the way, for anyone who's watching the new this year Apple TV show Pluribus, it's a great study in exactly this idea. In which there's a sort of a great joining. It's a sort of science fiction utopia, dystopia, in which there's a great joining of everybody in the world who kind of becomes one mind and work together in these ways. And there are 12 individuals who somehow didn't get to join the joining. And they are these extreme individuals, and each sort of eyes the other, and it's the extreme in communitarianism, totalitarianism, and the extreme in in the world of the individual. Um, so that's a very contemporary application. What we aim to be a part of is the Nasa riding on Pakad sweet spot. I like how he formulates that. A model of community wherein an individual can find a real sense of sustaining meaning without getting squashed, a community in which each individual can become deeply part of something larger than him or herself. In this third model, not only do we have a group that is pledged to some overarching noble ideal, but the individuals who comprise the group have carved out what we might call a carefully crafted dual identity. Each person, we might say, is both an individual and a part of a community that transcends them. Each person has a vital role to play in actualizing the mission of the whole. We're just going to skim this latter part, but he says, now I promised you we'd look at this in the context of three artists. He talks about Jackson Pollock and includes here a picture of a Jackson Pollock, which he describes as every individual element within the painting is recognizable, but there's no sense that it's coming together in any way that makes this painting a cohesive whole, right? So it's all about the individual. There's no real collectivity, as he suggests. Then the opposite end, a painter like Monet in the Impressionist movement, where he says, when you look, you get the sense you're looking at a beautiful scene. But when you stand up close and try to identify the individual elements in the painting, you find that astonishingly, they're not really there, right? It's the famous green smudge on the forehead of the figures in one of those Monets, where it's like it only makes sense when you view the whole thing as a collective. When you actually zoom in, the individuals are actually not discrete, distinct, or sort of real at all. They're only
Mhm.
in service of the collective viewed from a distance. Then he says there's a middle path where whole and part live in careful, balanced tension with one another. The work of Georges Seurat, the painter who founded the technique of pointillism. When you
Pointillism,
look,
yeah.
yes, when you look from afar, you discern a grand scheme, but that grand scheme doesn't require the sacrifice of the individual. If you zoom in, you find that every little mark of paint is its own individual dot. So a fascinating, turn to art history to make this point. He develops the point also in the context of biology. Every cell, is distinct and unique, but works in concert with the vision and mission of the whole. And he ends, what is it like to be part of the Surah kind of community? The community where individuality is prized and communal purpose is sacred. It's a deep privilege to be included, by God no less, through a divinely ordained act of counting, meaning because the Torah, God is the one who commands the counting and commands it through this dual language of pakad and nasa, of making every individual matter and also entrusting us with a mission as part of the greater whole. right? It's a deep privilege to be included in such a community. The act of counting that symbolizes the individual being entrusted with a larger purpose is truly an act of love. In God's counting and in the implicit stewardship that it engenders, we find a connection to a larger meaning that would be impossible to attain as a mere individual. In being counted by the divine, we find that we truly do count. And as he, suggests to us, all of this analysis, while you could make an argument for this irrespective of the verbs that are used, it's deepened in, as he showed us, by seeing two unique verbs being chosen for counting, nasa and pakad, and then seeing them juxtaposed to the places where they're used for counting immediately in the next verse. In at least one instance, we see them used with their alternate meanings to suggest to the reader that we're meant to draw a connection between nasa and pakad as counting and nasa and pakad in their alternate related meanings, lifting up, focusing on the individual, and appointing, entrusting, focusing on the role of the individual in a shared communal whole, mission and purpose. Leela, did you have a hand up? Great.
Yes, yes, I
Great.
do. I find that honestly it's unsatisfactory because he hasn't explained anything about what our sense of individuality is.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's understandable that we're a collective, but we perceive ourselves as individuals. That doesn't go away. And he hasn't really addressed that at all. He's just said it's all fine because you're just all part of a bigger thing. Yes, we
Mm-hmm.
are, but we're not. Clearly, we are individuals. And how do we affect that? There's no sort of dismissive action.
So I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you asking about the dimension of the individuality which stands apart from the individual's contribution to the whole? That's what feels like it's not being lifted up, or am I not? I didn't grasp it fully.
Okay. I think it's easy to say, it's really nice that we all form part of a collective,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a great feeling. It's really important. But we are also clearly, we are different and separate from each other. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that therein lies, our problem that is that in our feeling of separation, that's completely left unaddressed. I mean, it's so nice to think that God is counting us and therefore we're all part of God, but our life in the world is not like that. It just doesn't feel like that.
Because our life, I'm sorry, I'm only pushing because I want to make sure I really do understand.
Fine, don't
Our
apologize.
our life in the world is very separate from God and one another, and he doesn't do enough service to that.
Yeah, so he just glosses over that
Yeah.
fact that our conscious experience from day to day is of separateness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's fine to tell me that I'm part of a bigger thing, but I don't necessarily experience this pain and alienation of individuality all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess a few thoughts, and I accept the question on its premise. I think I think I think the work that he wants the verb nasa to do is the sense of individuality kind of full stop. Lift up every head is the notion that every person is a fully distinct, unique entity. Um, and then the work of Pakad is we each have a mission to contribute to the larger whole. Maybe what you're saying is in none of that is the acknowledgement of the pain and difficulty of being
He's taking it
unique
for
individuals.
granted that we can just somehow deal with that. He
Hmm.
hasn't actually offered any explanation,
Yeah.
any jump between the two states.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm
Yeah.
not making myself clear.
No, I think I understand. I and I all I can say is I agree with with your question, meaning I agree. He doesn't seem to see the experience of individual as particularly alone, or he feels that the model of the individual being part of something greater does the work, even if and you're making the point that it doesn't necessarily, or he doesn't tell us how it does, or many people's experience is that the dominant sense is being individual and therefore alone. Um, I think that's true. I think that's true. Um, I want to share just one more thing and then take any last questions, comments before we wrap up, which is that I was trying to find the right search term on the internet to see who else might discuss this point, and I came across a sikha, and the English version is not an accurate English translation. It's a related but different, but a sikha by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the past and one of the two early Roshei Yeshiva, Yeshivat Har Etzion, Gush, where I had the privilege of studying 20 something years ago, and truly a profound and powerful voice in our modern Orthodox community over a generation. And Rav Lichtenstein in the Sikha makes the same points. He starts out by saying, quoting the uh, the the psukim, one of the sets of psukim. This is actually on Parshat Naso, next week's Parashah, or the Parsha we'll read in 2 weeks. But same general idea, the language of Naso. And he points out that the sages, and Rabbi Foreman points this out, I believe, in the um, intro essay, that the sages call Bamidbar Chumash HaPikudim, literally what gives it its name in English, which I assume comes from the Greek, from the Septuagint, but the book of Numbers, Chumash HaPikudim, the book of censuses or countings. Um, and he says, we have these two verbs, pakad and nasa. They each have their additional meanings. It's interesting that the term mispar or sofer or monet is not used, and he develops the same idea, but he adds something lovely at the end, which I wanted to point out. Doesn't go in exactly the same direction, but develops a similar idea. And then staying on pakad, he says. In the book of Tehillim, the book of Psalms, the term pikudim appears in a number of additional instances, in which it refers to mitzvot, commandments, right? Pikudei Hashem yesharim misamche lev. We say this in Psalm 19 on Shabbat mornings. The statutes or commands or missions, appointments of God are upright and they bring joy to the heart. Ne'emanim kol pikudav, all God's charges are, trustworthy, faithful. Ki pikudecha natsarti, from Psalm 119, protected or guarded your charges, your commandments, your instructions, O God. So we see pakad, or pikudim, also referring to the mitzvot. And Rav Lichtenstein closes with this paragraph. Again, freestyle translating here. This is the additional meaning for this root, and we can learn from this usage of pakad an important message. The commandments, the mitzvot, are not mere instructions. They are actually the means through which God relates to us, and the means through which we connect to God. This is the central thing, Rav Lichtenstein's formulation, that differentiates us from other nations. Uh, when relating to someone from the Jewish people, yesh lizkor shehu kodem kol mitzuveh. The thing to remember is that we are first and foremost commanded beings, mikabel pikudot, people who receive orders, for lack of a better term. Zehu hameafyein haboleit shel ishiyuto. This is the outstanding, prominent characteristic of the personality of an Israelite. So he goes in really another dimension, I think not dissimilar from Rabbi Foreman. Rabbi Foreman sort of formulates it in the notion of mission, responsibility, and Rav Lichtenstein a little bit more sharply in the kind of language of charge and command. Again, I think you could take them in the same direction, but it's a little more broad and soft language in Rabbi Foreman of sort of the mitzvot as something which are deposited for us and they give us purpose. Rav Lichtenstein a little bit more of a sharp formulation of these are our appointed missions and we are commanded to do them, and that is sort of in the very act of counting us is also the act of commanding us. And that is sort of core to our identity. To be counted is to be commanded. So just another dimension, and there was at least one other modern Devar Torah from the last couple of years online that I found that delved into this as well. So I don't know, Rabbi Foreman doesn't cite anybody who really develops this. It doesn't seem to appear in the medieval commentaries or earlier modern commentaries. So I don't know if this is like a late 20th, early 21st century discovery, this reading of Naso and Pakad as unique with their secondary meanings combining to kind of create this complex of the relationship between the individual and the community. But it certainly seems like a flavor that I haven't seen prior to this kind of constellation of commentaries kind of over this last couple decades or so. So since the hour is late, I'm going to leave us here. Hopefully, there was what to chew on. Um, yeah, James popped a thought. Could that be an answer to Leela's challenge that the way we observe and connect to our Judaism is our individuality? Interesting question. Still, I think the potency of how do we contend with the inherent loneliness, or more maybe than Rav Lichtenstein might be in the direction of Rav Soloveitchik's lonely man of faith kind of question about contending with the profound and deep solitude of the charge of mitzvot in a way, or of humanity in another way. I mean, there's certainly a lot philosophically and experientially or phenomenologically, I don't know, to unpack there. But we're on our way. We dove in with Rabbi Foreman with his intro and with his essay on Bamidbar, one of the shorter ones, that one central Torah insight about pakad and nasa being quite distinct verb choices. Each carries an additional element to it, the sense of lifting up individuality, the sense of charging with mission, and that those are meant to work together to create in an ideal world, a harmonious sense where we have a sense of our individuality, but our mission, even though it might be particular to us, every person's mission is going to be slightly different, is about contributing to something larger than we are. Again, still plenty that's fraught and complicated about it. And again, we're off next Monday. We'll be back on the following week, Tuesday. And great to have everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks for your patience for a late start and a late end. And love to my dad, and take care, everybody. Great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Laila Tov.
Bye.